And this is where I normally stop recording and start editing. But this time, as you can probably guess from the title of the video, I'll take you along for the ride. So here we are. This is the raw mix I just recorded. As you can see, I have 3 separate stereo tracks. First one are the drums, which are mixed inside the modular with the Cosmix by Cosmotronic. It's a really cool mixer to mix drums on because it has a drive setting which saturates and compresses the signal a little bit. Then we have the synths. Those are recorded from the Tex Mix by Tesseract Modular. And then there's the effects, which are also coming from the Tex Mix, but for these I'm using the stereo monitor output, and that's a really useful feature of that mixer, to have a flexible way to route audio around your system, or as in my case, into my interface. All of this is recorded with a Focusrite Scarlett, by the way. Let's start off by looping a loud section of the track, and then I go to the first step in my mixing workflow, which is subtractive equalizing. I tend to low cut everything, but of course not everything in the same amount. For the drums I keep the low cut around 30 Hz, sometimes a little bit higher. It depends on how much bass there is in the synth track. And then, by using the solo function of this equalizer, which most equalizers have, I'm looking for the frequency at which the kick drum has its punch. I won't be actually boosting it here, but I'm just looking for that frequency. And most of the time this is around 90 to 130 Hz, somewhere in between those frequencies. So I remember that frequency and I disable that band on the equalizer. Then I do a cut of the low mids somewhere around 300 to 350 Hz. This takes away some of the muddy sound, but just be sure not to take too much away from the low frequencies of the snare, and certainly don't go as low that you start cutting the bass of the kick drum. Let's take away a little bit more of those sub-bass frequencies. We can always change this later. Okay, so now let's have a look at the synths. Let me solo them. I use a low cut equalizer again. I adjust it very roughly at this stage. It's always possible to fine-tune it later. As you can see, I make a little dip at around 100 Hz. This is to give the kick a little bit more room to live. I also take away a little bit of the low mids, just as I did with the drums. And I usually do this somewhere from 200 to 400 Hz, somewhere in between that, but not too much. What I sometimes do, but won't in this track, is use a mid-side equalizer, in which the mid channel has the same settings as the regular equalizer. But for the sides, I cut everything below, let's say 100 to 200 Hz. You can even boost the highs a little bit, but like I said, I won't be doing this here because this track already has a lot of highs in it. Let's take a look at the effects. I will low cut the effects from somewhere around 100 Hz to 200 Hz usually. You can see from the frequency analyzer there's not a lot of bottom end to begin with, so I cut away the little rumble there is. Now let's move on to the next step in my mixing workflow, which is compression. I will compress the drums using an API 2500 clone from Waves. I bought these plugins when there was a really heavy discount. The settings for drums are usually a slow attack, somewhere around 10 to 30 milliseconds, a ratio of 3 to 4, and I turn the release completely down, as short as it can go. And then I start adjusting the threshold and the other parameters until I'm pleased with how it sounds. The main thing I'm looking for here is increasing the punch and the impact of the drums without losing too much bottom end. I almost always add a second equalizer behind the compression, and I like to use the API 550A. The reason I use this equalizer and not just the Ableton native stock equalizer, which is perfectly good, is because with the API I can boost the highs a lot without it becoming harsh or annoying. I also tend to do another low mid cut at 400 Hz, and I sometimes boost the bass at 50 or 100 Hz, but this really depends on what track I'm mixing. Generally speaking, when I boost the lows or the highs at this stage, I don't do it in the mixbus or vice versa. Now for the synths, I use a compressor as a glue. So I use a fast attack, a medium release, I use a lower ratio, and I turn on the softness setting. And when I turn down the threshold, which for this compressor means you're actually turning the knob to the right, you can see I try not to compress too much, 1 or 2 dB at maximum, because if you really push it, you turn every sound into a square wave by kind of clipping it. I usually don't do a lot of work on the effects, apart from the low cut, but what you can do, and I will show you here, is use a mid-side compression technique, where you compress the mids rather heavily and you leave the side completely open. And this both creates a really wide stereo spread and helps to make everything sit in the mix a lot better, because by compressing the mid channel and not turning it up with makeup gain, you actually just lower the volume. What I also like to do is add a really subtle reverb to the drums. For this, I'm using the Waves Hybrid Reverb. I really like how this reverb sounds. I tested more than a dozen of reverb plugins, free plugins as well as really expensive plugins, and in the end there was only one left that had both a really good sound and a really flexible interface. I will just modify a preset called Tiled Chamber. I cut away a lot of the lows, you can go up to 300 Hz or higher, and I also cut away some of the highs, so it's a little less bright. Then I make the tail of the reverb a lot shorter, and I also like to add a little bit of pre-delay to my reverbs. Then I shorten the reverb even more. And when I'm pleased with the general character of the reverb, I turn down the send on the drums, even to the point where I think I can't hear it at all. But you notice when I then mute the reverb, the drums really sound dry. And this is the most reverb I'll add to a EURORACK recording. All the other reverbs are from the modular itself. Now for my mixbus, I do compression first. I again use the API 2500 compressor. I use a slow attack, a ratio about 3 or 4, a really fast release, and I switch it to the stereo setting. I do a low cut, that's what this does, and then I turn down the threshold until I get 1 or maximum 2 dB of gain reduction. And I use the API just because I know it very well, because I've been using it so much. But you can just as well use another kind of glue compressor. Analog Obsession has a really good free one. Let me try approaching the same kind of compression. And of course you can also use the stock Ableton glue plugin, which is also a clone of the same type of compressor. Most people use an SSL-G mixbus compressor. For some reason I really don't like how it works. And both the Analog Obsession and the Ableton Glue compressor are actually clones of that compressor. But for me personally, after rigorous testing of a lot of mixbus compressor plugins, the API is just the clear winner. And then I use another API 550A equalizer. And I go back and forth a little bit, boosting the lows, boosting the highs, adjusting an equalizer here and there until it sounds right to my ears. Notice how I changed the characteristic of the EQ band. Sometimes I use a tape saturation plugin after this. Most of the times I don't, but when I really like a track and I want it to stand out more like a song and less like a jam, I add this to my mixbus. As you can see, this is where my computer really became laggy. Normally it works fine, but with the screen capture software on at the same time, it had a little bit of difficulties. But what I essentially do is just make sure that on the input as well as on the output of this tape plugin, everything is in the red, but not clipping. There's also a really interesting wow and flutter feature, which when you turn it up sounds like this. But I generally turn it down to the point where I can't hear it anymore. I'm sure it adds some of that magic tape sound, even if I can't hear it. But what this plugin really does for me Let's add a little bit of warmth and, more importantly, some saturation, i.e. compression, so the limiter at the end of all of this doesn't have to work as hard. Speaking of which, I always use the limiter made by George Young. Apologies if I butchered that name. What George did was a great service to all mankind, especially musicians. He made a free version of a Waves plugin, and it's not a clone, it's really just inspired by, and it has a really low CPU drain. So thank you, George. What I do to set my limiter is turn the ceiling down to -1.9. This is to avoid clipping of the true peaks, and then essentially I just watch what the level of the output is on the VU meter, and I turn down the threshold of the limiter just below that value. So it's actually limiting and not just used as an elaborate volume control. So there it is. This is my mix. All I need to do now is render it. I use these settings just because I'm using the render to import in video editing software afterwards, but you could just as well render it to 16-bit. And this is all I wanted to show you. I hope you learned something and that you enjoyed watching this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.